Black pity, the diasporans' inability to free themselves from the past pain of slavery, developing from it either an irrational hatred of white people, a disdain for other black people,
I've listened to your black ass talk all day about how much you can't stand black folks.
Ain't two of them in the history of the world that's worth a scroll for it.
or a combination of both. It's this sort of black pity which results in the turning of tables. That is the world where it is now deemed acceptable to be racist towards white people because of the oppression that their ancestors dished out on other races. It's this same black pity which can also lead to characters such as Uncle Ruckus developing in real life, where a disdain for other black people can create twisted individuals who fight against their own.
African-Americans speak ghetto. But when it comes to black people, I think they're all ugly and I have nothing in common with them. I'm different from African-Americans because I'm white. My figure is just like Kim Kardashian, and she's a wonderful role model.
And also make, well, white supremacists. Part of the reason for this is going to be the false association of white oppression and Christianity. The reason why many people to this day make this mistake was because of the multitude of slave owners cherry-picking verses to trick the slaves into thinking that the twisted establishment of slavery was handed down by God, and that refusing to subject to this was an affront to the Almighty God himself. Of course, if you had access to the Book of Philemon, which is literally Paul telling a slave owner to treat an escaped slave as a free brother in Christ, and 1 Corinthians 7:21, which tells slaves to aspire to gain their freedom, you would clearly see that the Bible is never in support of the transatlantic slave trade. That was an abuse of slavery in every kind. Wait, hold on. Isn't there only one type of slavery, though? Slavery, defined as a condition of having to work very hard without proper remuneration, payment, or appreciation. This is a practice as old as time. It didn't start with the white man, and definitely not in the 16th century. I mean, under this definition, wouldn't a minimum wage job be slavery? Okay, but in all seriousness, slavery did occur in civilizations including ancient Egypt, ancient China, the Akkadian Empire, Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, ancient Israel, ancient Greece, ancient India, the Roman Empire, the Arab Islamic Caliphates and Sultanates, Nubia, the pre-colonial empires of sub-Saharan Africa, and the pre-Columbian civilizations of the Americas. This sure is a lot of slavery for which we can't blame white people for. Ancient slavery, at the time, consisted of a mixture of debt slavery, that is, working under somebody else until you earned whatever you owed them. So that's the most common form of slavery in the Old Testament. There's punishment for crime also, prisoners of war, child abandonment, and children born to slaves. Today, modern slavery includes that, but also human trafficking and abused domestic servitude. So those will be cases where you're mistreating your poor maid who cleans your dishes, and as such. Even now, an estimated 50 million people, 50, are living in modern slavery on any given day, at least as of 2021. This is nearly 1 in every 150 people in the world. That's a lot. What ignorance does to a black man. When we understand slavery in its entirety as not being something we can only blame white people for, it then becomes a lot harder to use this as a tool to mess with the minds of black people. Those ignorant to this, however, are easy pickings for those who wish to use this ignorance against them. Look at Cassius Clay, aka Muhammad Ali. His conversion story to Islam was heavily founded upon the premise sold to him by Muslim proselytizers, who convinced him that Christianity was the white devil's religion, and that Islam was the true black man's religion. This would be ignoring a lot of things. That being, prior to Christianity ever reaching Africa in the early 2nd century via the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, that's one of the oldest in the world even before the ancient Romans. Back then, the religion of the black man would have been centered around fetish priests.
What did he say?
No, not horny priests, fetish as in like black magic, juju. Those guys, and tribal paganism. The Muslims didn't even make it to Africa until the 7th century, which is 5 centuries after Christianity ever arrived in Africa in the first place. Not only this, but even amongst the white men who invaded the land, there were divisions. There were many even missionaries, pastors and nuns who were fully benefiting from and participating in the atrocities, but also many who were fighting against such atrocities and teaching the locals properly about Christianity. One of such missionaries were Joseph Rhodes Dunwell, who established the presence of the Methodist Church in Ghana in 1835. He's the main reason why Wesleyan Methodism spread so greatly throughout Ghana. Here's another case example. During the 15th century, Portuguese navigators inched their way south along the Atlantic coast of Africa in search of a direct sea route to India and possible allies in their crusade against Islam. A chief in Senegambia, so that's just basically Senegal and the Gambia, a chief in Senegambia accepted an invitation to travel to Lisbon, where he and a number of his followers were baptized. It's stuff like this which the slaves, especially those who hadn't relocated to the South Americas or the Americas in general, or the UK, it is these kind of things which those slaves kept in mind when they still worshipped God despite the atrocities which their slave masters would inflict upon them. Why don't Caribbeans and African Americans think the same? If you look around today, you'll see that the issue of black pity is an issue which predominantly ails African Americans. You would think that such an issue would equally impact the Afro-Caribbeans and the British Caribbeans, who would also have ancestors who were forced to become slaves in new lands. This would especially be the case for the Caribbeans, to which 40% of enslaved Africans were sent. Why then is this not the case? Part of this could be due to the difference in time spent regarding the generations. More slaves were dying in the Caribbean than the US because of the harsher heat. These slaves, when they died, were then replaced with more slaves shipped directly from Africa, rather than what happened in the US. In the US, there were still enough remaining slaves to reproduce within the US, resulting in those slaves in the Caribbean having fewer generations, separating them from those who were still in Africa, than the United States, who would rather have reproduced and repopulated within the land. Amongst those who were still alive and living in their respective areas, there were far less black slaves in the US, where black slaves were the minority, whereas in the Caribbean, the blacks were the majority. When groups of people are a minority, they tend to feel a greater obsessive need to stick together and preserve their sense of identity. The medical term for this? Minority neurosis. This is something which blacks outside of the US will tend to accuse African Americans of being quite guilty of. After all, it's this group of blacks on the internet who seem to be the most defensive on who can come to the functions and cookouts, say the N-word, etc. Whereas for other areas, if white guys want to dance to black music, or eat black food, or speak black languages, it tends to be celebrated. This point of view is neatly summed up by John C. Walter, who writes, "One might say that the history of the West Indies was characterized by a greater feeling of successes over the white man during and after slavery, by an absence of segregation, and by the practice of intermarriage. The resulting attitude ruled out the massive feeling of uncertainty that developed and remained among blacks in this country, i.e. the United States, during and after the slave period." Not only this, but the US civil rights movement of the 1960s led to major improvements in conditions of black Americans and an upsurge of black nationalism. That is, the belief that black people share a common culture and worldview, have a common destiny, have had common experiences of slavery, oppression, colonialism, and exploitation. Aspects of such an ideology can still be seen today, where modern African Americans discover that not all slaves were taken on ships, but that colonizers also built castles and forts in Africa to keep the slaves. For instance, look at Elmina Castle, Cape Coast Castle, and Fort James, all in Ghana. What does it then mean to be black? In the United States, race has predominantly always been split into two categories, colored and non-colored. Today, as language has updated over time, it is now black or white. Those who immigrated to the US from Hispanic nations or other regions are simply ignored a lot during these race conversations. In this division of black and white, there's the one-drop rule, which is used to determine where you belong. Essentially, if you have even a little bit of African ancestry, then you're black. Some people may disagree, but generally this is the case in the United States. So, if Cole Palmer, for instance, was born in the US, by this one-drop rule, he would classify as black, due to his grandfather being from St. Kitts and Nevis. This would definitely not be the case in the Caribbean, as race is seen as more of a spectrum. Same occurs in Latin America. On either end of the spectrum, there's still black and white, but with minimal classifications within, based not only on skin color but facial features, hair texture, and other physical traits. This difference was made most obvious to the world when Tyler, in December 2023, described herself as colored rather than black, to the outrage of many African Americans. One of such other subdivisions would be mulattoes, which would refer to people of mixed African and European ancestry. Such a term is deemed offensive in the US due to the name possibly deriving from the Spanish/Portuguese term mulatto, which refers to the half-horse, half-donkey hybrid, the mule. In the US, due to the one-drop rule, these people would simply be deemed black and be expected to fully relate to the African American struggles, even though their mixed ancestry would present a more complex history of issues to deal with, such as a rejection of their true identity from both the blacks and the whites around them. This unfortunately tends to happen a lot, especially in Latin America. I mean, did you know black Mexicans exist? Such issues are the main reason why many of such people usually tend to disassociate themselves from both the black and white communities.
The same, papi. It's not the same. They try to salsa that shit off. I'd be like, no, it's not the same. I know black. Negro nunca, nunca. I know no, nunca. I know black. I'm like, no, you black. No.
Considering all of this, this is why some, and I can't stress this enough, some, not all, also tend to make a distinction between American-based words to describe blackness such as negro, and black, and what words they would use to describe themselves, such as colored, mulatto, or simply their nationalities. Here's a story from the book Brown Girl, Brown Stones by Paul Marshall to make this point clear. So, the Barbadians' animosity for African American people en masse is made evident, for example, at a meeting of the Association of Barbadian Homeowners and Businessmen. Following one speaker's suggestion that you need to strike out that word Barbadian and put Negro, the association members explode with outraged gestures and faces that are contorted, alive now with wrath. Selena's mother Sila and her woman friends, landlords all, associate African Americans with the category rumors and reject the idea of racial solidarity, much less simple understanding, in favor of raw class-based survival of the fittest thinking. Let the rumors get out and struggle like I did, says Flory Trotman, and Silla supports her, adding, it's true the rumors is our own colour, but if they was white or yellow and couldn't do better, we'd still be overcharging them. No, nobody wanna admit it, but people got a right to claw their way to the top, and those on top got a right to scuffle to stay there. So, back on topic, how do we view slavery today? Now that we've seen the consequences that slavery has played in the lives of black people across the world, we could truly begin to understand and dissect the parts of black people's mind where black pity in some form or another may exist. For African Americans, they would have to learn to be comfortable with their differences, understanding that they are unlike their white neighbors, but due to their history in America, they will also not be like their other black diasporans and black Africans. They will have things unique to them, such as blues music, hoods, soul food, etc., and they will need to come to terms with these things and enjoy them. This doesn't mean that they should dissociate themselves from other black people, as is the case with many black Africans and diasporans doing the same to them, but rather not let their differences be divisive. What I mean by this is, let's say, for example, not using the hoods as an excuse to look down upon African Americans and push them away as something to be avoided. When this sort of thinking is understood at a soul level or deeper level, then black pity is no longer a tool that others can use to manipulate our thinking and puppeteer us. Is there really a thing as a black community? You'll probably notice that I've said us a decent number of times and used the term black a lot to describe people with at least some African ancestry. This type of language would indicate this attribute as being something we could use to classify a group of people, aka a community. My question to you is, am I right in thinking that there's some sort of black community? Like I said before, there's a belief, especially amongst the African Americans, that black people share a common culture and worldview, have a common destiny, and have had a common experience of slavery, oppression, colonialism, and exploitation. So, there's two sides to this, which I want you to consider both of. Remember how we talked about the differences in how Caribbeans and African Americans think, despite how they both went through slavery? Not only this, but depending on where you look, there seems to be some form of hostility, as indicated by the story, or the quotes from that story, which I've just read. Are these differences enough to disprove this belief? They shouldn't be enough to cause beef, but do they pop holes in the idea of us being a community? However, on the other side, if you look around closely enough, there does seem to be some form of camaraderie between melanated people. When two black guys walk past each other, they tend to give each other the nod. This seems to be a universally understood thing which requires no explanation regardless of which country they are from. If a black guy nods to you, you nod back. Nobody needed to teach them about this, it was instinctual. Would this be proof enough of the existence of a black community? If so, would this be something which we could use to describe a shared experience amongst people of this community? And would racism be another example? I could easily go through this in another video, considering the point of this whole channel, but during this Black History Month, which is when I want to upload this video, I also want to get you thinking about what it means to be black, what history we could be possibly celebrating this month, whether you fully understand all of the history, or if there's something that you're forgetting or missing. Think on that, and as you do, I wish you a happy and productive Black History Month.